Welcome, everybody, to Moms for America. I'm Jalene Jackson. I am a mama of 5 children. I live in Chevy Chase, Maryland, which is just about 15 minutes from the White House. So I am close to some really interesting action. I'm the National Vice President for Moms for America over Cottage Meeting. The whole premise of Moms for America is that liberty begins at home. And we teach Mama the miracles and the stories of America and the principles upon which America was taught. And then she in turn goes and teaches her children and her grandchildren and her husband. And she shores up the 4 walls of her home, which strengthens her home. And when you have a strong home, you have a strong community, and it just flows from there. And so I've been involved with Moms for America for over a decade, and I have attended cottage meetings, and I have taught cottage meetings for over 13 years. So today, girls, I hope you feel like you have a semi-decent working knowledge of the Constitution of the United States. Last week, we talked about the last 4 articles of the Constitution. Remember, there are 7 articles in the Constitution and 27 amendments. And we talked about the last 4 articles and then the first 10 amendments known as the Bill of Rights. And this is what our founding fathers gave us, those 7 articles and those 10 amendments plus 11 and 12. So it's kind of a trick question. If you ask people, how many amendments did our founders give us? They actually gave us 12 amendments, but the first 10 are known as the Bill of Rights. And remember last week in that 5th article, states' rights, that was kind of the impetus that led to legalization of gay marriage in 2013. States that weren't willing to recognize other acquired rights of certain states that had legalized gay marriage and states that weren't legalizing it. And the Supreme Court got involved and actually cited the 14th Amendment as the reason why they legalized gay marriage. And we're going to study the 14th Amendment today, and we're going to see what our founding fathers really intended for the 14th Amendment and why they would not have been pleased that the Supreme Court had misinterpreted and actually changed things that the founders had felt and believed and woven into our Constitution. And can I just say that under the executive branch, the 2nd article, I had recommended that you women watch a 13-minute video from by the Thomas Jefferson Center. You can just pull it up on YouTube, entitled "The Most Powerful Political Office in the World." And it helps you understand what has happened to this executive branch and how it has grown much more powerful. And can I just give you a recommendation that kind of goes along with that 3rd article, the judiciary branch, which talks about the courts and the Supreme Court. So remember how last week I told you I had heard that there was a wonderful documentary that came out on Clarence Thomas, the longest sitting Black justice on the Supreme Court in the history of the court, and how his documentary came out about a year ago. And it was one of the highest watched documentaries on Amazon Prime. But then Amazon Prime last month during Black History Month removed that documentary, gave no reason for why they removed it, but I was able to find it. I just Googled created equal Clarence Thomas in his own words, and Vivian will give you that link in our picks for this week. And I believe she put it in there for last week's email. My husband and I went away for a little getaway this weekend. And this is what we chose to do on Friday night. We ordered Chinese and we watched. It was almost 2 hours and it was so good. So if you just Google that, up will come a way that you can watch it outside of Amazon Prime. I think we had to download YouTube app, but we were able to watch it on our Roku. And it just talks about his history and his heart. He's a very private man. He rarely gives interviews, and he talks all throughout this documentary. And you understand, and you begin to understand and see and feel the heart of this man who very much reveres natural law, God's law, and what our founding fathers intended. And he had kind of a Saul to Paul experience in his life. And he talks about that, and it's fascinating. So I would really recommend, it's brand new out, just came out the end of 2019, really 2020. So it's only been out a year, and you wouldn't even know it was there because the press and Hollywood and those types have tried to suppress it and remove it. But you can find it easily, and we watched it for free. So I would really recommend that. That will kind of give you an insight as to his journey to the Supreme Court. And we also talked about last week our first freedom, our very first amendment, the freedom to exercise religion, and how Jefferson, that statement when those Baptists came to him and wanted the federal government, he was the president at the time, wanted the federal government to get involved and tell the state of Connecticut what kind of state religion they could have. And Jefferson was like, oh no, the state of the Union doesn't get involved in states the way they treat religion. That's for you, your state government, the people to determine. There should be a separation of state and church. Well, 150 years later, the Supreme Court took that statement from Jefferson and went to town and used that statement as an impetus to remove prayer, to remove Bible reading, to remove the Lord's Prayer. About 13 years ago, I lived in Oregon, in a little liberal town along the Columbia River, Hood River, Oregon, and my children were not allowed to pledge allegiance to the flag in the schools because they mentioned the word God, and that was offensive to people that did not believe in God. So on the very last day of school, so there were flags in the classroom, but the children in Hood River, that little town, were not allowed to pledge. And on the last day of school, my little fourth grade girl raised her hand and asked her teacher if they could pledge on the last day, and he allowed them. And I'll never forget her coming home, and she was so excited to tell me that she was able to pledge on the last day of school in fourth grade in Hood River, Oregon. So this is what has come from the distortion and misinterpretation of the Supreme Court through the years and prohibiting our religious rights with that First Amendment. And we also talked about how free speech, how our free speech is being censored, and certain entities, particularly big tech, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, is, even though they're a privately owned company, they are shutting down conservative voices. They're removing, their Twitter feeds, they're shutting their sites down. And someone asked me last week, well, they're private entities, can't they do whatever they want? And as I looked into that, yes, typically you could, but there are rules about giving support to candidates. And when you squash all conservative voices and give a big voice to more liberal-based ideas, that is, if you were to monetize that, that would be considered giving huge contributions to those kind of political parties. And there are rules in place that limit large entities from contributing to campaigns of political leaders. And so that is where the litigation, and up on the Hill, they're trying to rein in this Section 230 that has given big tech all these powers to decide whose voice they're going to let heard and whose voice they're going to censor and delete. And so we're seeing that controversy of that First Amendment free speech aspect being played out and argued right now in Congress. And so, girls, if you can just remember that the purpose of the Constitution was to protect families. Our founders understood that God's program is the family. Look, he gave us Adam and Eve. He set the example of what marriage is between a man and a woman and told them to multiply and procreate. Satan's plan, Satan, the devil, powers of darkness, whatever you want to call it, is to destroy the family, to make a husband, a wife, man and woman look foolish, like they're buffoons, like we have to look to other entities and to governments to tell us what our rights are and to give us blessings, so to speak. So the founders knew that their highest priority had to be to protect that family, because you would have a strong family, you would have a strong society, and that's how you would keep this republic that was going to be based on God's law, natural law, people's law, the rule of law. And so they knew the enemies of freedom through the last century have known that if we can create ignorance in the citizenry so they don't really understand the rule of law, or they don't understand the history, that they can get us to be more emotionally directed by fear. So if they can convince us that all the problems need to be solved, all roads need to lead to Washington, D.C. to solve our problems, that we won't really understand, or we won't have access to our political leaders like we would if we keep our government strong. And our founders intended for a strong local self-government to ensure our human freedom. So, because we have access to our state legislators, they live in our neighborhoods, our school councils, even, our governor, we can go up to our Capitol and, let our voice be heard. But we have a harder time if we're convinced that our solutions are only to be had in Washington, D.C. So if these entities, and we're going to talk about who these entities, these organizations are that wanted to grow and make our government look more kingly, like a big, powerful executive. So to kind of keep us ignorant. And then when we don't really understand how we can exact change, we're kind of fearful. We're afraid about the state of America. And then we actually start to hate people that we feel, aren't serving our purpose. So you have ignorance plus fear equals hate. And then you see people being motivated out of hate. I'm going to vote for this person because I hate the other person. So instead of us now voting for principles and things that we stand for, we're voting for things that we're against. And we saw that in this last election. But when you understand the Constitution, what the founding fathers meant in the first 100 years of these principles of limited government and prosperity economics, then we're empowered. We know solutions. We know how it's supposed to be. And we're less drawn into this whole emotionalism, like, oh, my person didn't make it into office, the country's going to fall apart. That kind of thing that leads to fear and leads to hate and actually leads to violence that we've seen for the whole last year, probably, as we've seen riots in countries in cities all across the country. And so our founding fathers understood that America was a promised land and that we were a remnant of the house of Israel, and that America had a manifest destiny to be an example and a blessing to the entire human race. And these are all principles I'm quoting to you out of the 5,000-year leap. That is the very last principle out of the 5,000-year leap, that America has a manifest destiny to be a blessing, an example to the entire human race. And we haven't been that. America is starting to look like every other country out there. And so I think really maybe God brought about this pandemic to wake us up, because now we are worried about the state of affairs in this country. And if it can get enough mothers, particularly, to wake up, and people that love America to wake up, then it will justify the heavens for God to intervene and to heal us, because prophecy says this nation shall endure, and God can heal our land if we will turn to him. And so, okay, having said that, that was a fairly lengthy introduction, but I just want to make sure our heads are all right on the same page. Moving forward, let's turn to the very beginning of this last section, section 4, from in seminar 2. You're going to love this manual. This is going to be your go-to manual for the Constitution throughout, the next years. So and make sure you're getting your third manual, because we're going to be on to our third manual next week. So remember, amendments 11 and 12 came from our founders, and then amendments 13, 14, and 15 came right after the Civil War, and they had to do with abolishing slavery. And then amendments 16 through 27 all began to come to pass in the 1900s. And remember, ladies, every time you amend or change the Constitution, it supersedes an existing part of the Constitution, and that is not always a good thing. And we're going to see how some of these amendments, 14, 16, 17, 25, are very dangerous and have really upset the balance that the founders' checks and balances that the founders intended for this country to be under. So the 11th the 11th Amendment came to pass when George Washington was still in office. And it says that a citizen can't sue other states. And this is what had happened. A man from South Carolina wanted to sue Georgia, and the federal government got involved and they made sure that that case was heard. And so this just confirms that the states will be able to exercise their sovereign authority in order to protect the state. So they're not inundated with other citizens from other states that want to sue them. So, for instance, you live in California and you want to sue someone in Oregon, you have to go to Oregon and you have to go under the Oregon court system in order to litigate. And so it just helps from the states being too bogged down with lawsuits from citizens of other states. The 12th Amendment was given to correct some weaknesses in the Electoral College from the jump. Because remember, when John Adams won, the person in the Electoral College that has the most votes wins. The second person with the second most votes becomes the vice president. Well, what happened is John Adams won, and he was a Federalist. That they didn't have political parties back then, but he had more Federalist, stronger government ideas. And an anti-Federalist, Thomas Jefferson, was elected as the vice president. And so we had a mixed party presidential team, and they didn't work together very well. So they made a few tweaks in order so that wouldn't happen in the 12th Amendment. To be honest with you, the Electoral College has gradually been changed from what the founders intended. It still is a very good example of representative government, because if we just had presidents elected by popular vote, always New York City, Chicago, LA could determine the elections of every election, and that wouldn't be representative government, would it? So with the Electoral College, every state, even the small states, have a voice as who will be president, and you get enough smaller states pooling together and you can determine an election more fairly than just major population centers. And so the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. It came just a few months after the Civil War ended. And the 14th Amendment has gone on to do something that is completely contrary to what the founders wanted. The 14th Amendment was supposed to give Black people's children the same citizen rights as all the other citizens in the United States. So former slaves' children were given full citizen rights. And they did that because, but can I just tell you something that has come from that? So that's what that amendment says, the first part of the 14th Amendment. But what it has gone on to be interpreted as today is to protect illegal immigrants that come over to the United States, have a child, and now are declaring that child has access to this 14th Amendment protection. It's been termed as anchor babies. And really, you can see how it discriminates against people that are trying to come to the United States legally. I mean, their children aren't getting some of these same privileges who are trying to go through the correct legal process. They might be stuck in countries that are corrupt or have dictators, and they're wanting the blessings of liberty, just like other people that are coming into our country illegally. But the illegal people coming in are being rewarded, and that doesn't certainly seem fair to those that are trying to go through the proper legal process. And so it protects illegal children that are born in the United States, and then opens up the door for all the services and the programs for their parents who are here illegally. Now, the second part of this 14th Amendment, which was supposed to give former slaves, children, citizens' rights, says that no state shall make or enforce any law which will abridge the privilege or immunity of the citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or process without due process of law or equal protection of the law. And that is known as the Equal Protection Clause. And that is what the United States Supreme Court cited when they legalized gay marriage nationally in 2013. So you can see how this amendment has been misconstrued. Now, that second part of the 14th Amendment originally was put in 1868 to kind of be a backstop for those southern states that weren't exactly giving all the rights to their former slaves. And so it was meant to punish these southern states if they weren't going to comply with the abolishment of slavery. But about 60 years after this 14th Amendment was passed, the Supreme Court ruled, used this 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause to punish the states if they didn't provide equal rights to everyone. And that is when the Supreme Court, 150 years later from when this was given, said, well, if there's gay marriage in Massachusetts and there's gay marriage in this state and that state, but you go to a state that doesn't have gay marriage, well, they're not having a equal protection of their laws that they have in Massachusetts versus states that don't have gay marriage. And so the Supreme Court got involved and distorted what our founders meant. First of all, we know our founders meant that the republic should be based on God's law. The very first principle in this 5,000-year leap says the most reliable basis for sound government, strong government, and just human relations is God's law. And God's law has spoken on marriage. Marriage is between a man and a woman. So you can see how the founders would not have been pleased that something that they had meant to abolish slavery was now being the means to defend gay marriage, and now opening up the door to the Equality Act, which will protect transgender rights, sexual orientation rights. And so you can see how our founding father, what they intended is being misinterpreted and misused. So what really essentially what this 14th Amendment did was open the doors for the federal government to begin to punish the states. And that is, remember, the founding fathers wanted a small central government and most of the rights to be retained to the people and the states to determine these things, not the federal government, okay? And so that is what has come from the 14th Amendment, which is problematic, which needs to be fixed at some point if we're going to reinstate the Constitution from the viewpoint of our founders. The 15th Amendment just said that Black people have the right to vote. The 16th Amendment came along 43 years later after those 13, 14, and 15th amendments talking about abolishment of slavery and what was to come from that. So in the early 1600s, now girls, I want you to try and focus as much as you can on the 16th and 17th Amendment because they went hand in hand. And there were entities that were behind the 16th and 17th Amendment that fundamentally wanted to change America and the way that we govern in this country for their own selfish purposes. And we're going to talk about this in Seminar 3. But what the 16th Amendment did was put us on the road to big government and really socialism, where government was now going to grow to much larger proportions than the founders intended. Because what the 16th Amendment did was gave the right for the federal government to directly come into your homes and to tax you personally with an income tax. Now, remember, our founding fathers in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8 and Section 9 said that it was the states were to determine how they were going to tax the people. So if the state had 3% of the population of America, the state would be responsible for 3% of the federal budget. And it was the state government to decide, will we use some of our resources? How will we tax the people to come up with our part of the federal government? So by passing the 16th Amendment, it completely bypassed the voice of the state, and the federal government can now directly tax individuals, hence the income tax. And really that 16th Amendment was a program to soak the rich, if you will, because it's not uniform. The founders wanted a uniform tax. So even if you're a millionaire, you only paid like a tithe. You only pay 10%. Whether you're poor, you pay 10%. Whether you're rich, you pay 10%. It was a uniform, fair tax for all. But when they implemented the income tax, what it did, they implemented a graduated income tax scale. So the more you made, the more money you had to be taxed. And so that meant the income of wealthier people was less sacred because were required to pay more. And really, you could say, well, that's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment, because we're not being taxed fairly now at this point. But there was a reason behind the 16th and 17th, because these entities, these powers knew that if you can tax people, the government gets bigger, you could offer more goodies and programs to people, and the congressmen that are elected every 2 years can take home some of these goodies to their people in their constituents and say, I'm going to solve your problems. Look, I've got this program that's going to help you, and it will reassure that he gets elected. Okay. And so the House members kind of like this idea of, growing the government, getting more money so I can bring the goodies home to my people and ensure that I stay in office. Now, this wouldn't have happened if the 17th Amendment hadn't been passed. And those two amendments were passed almost within months of each other. And what the 17th Amendment did is it removed the vertical check and balance from the federal government. So there was a wall in between the federal government and the people. And who stood on that wall that protected the states were senators, because senators were elected by their state legislature, not the people. And if you don't understand that, people nowadays will go, well, the people should elect their representatives or their Congress people and their senators. No, that's not what the founding fathers wanted. And this is why George Washington was one of the greatest proponents of the Senate being elected by the state legislatures. And so when Thomas Jefferson came back from overseas, remember Thomas Jefferson was an ambassador in England when the Constitution was being written, and he asked Washington, why did you not have the people vote for their senators? And remember when Washington had this conversation, he said, it's, when you pour hot tea into a saucer before drinking it, why do you do that? Why do you not immediately drink it when you pour your hot tea? And Jefferson said, well, I let it cool, of course. And Washington said, that is what the Senate is for. The Senate is to cool down that hot-headed or imprudent legislation that the House might try and pass. Because remember that three-headed eagle, the House, who served for 2 years, is known as the wing of compassion. They're the problem solvers. They want to take care of problems, so they want to tax more to get more money to solve more people's problems so they can stay in office and get reelected. But the Senate was supposed to kind of be like, let cooler heads prevail and ask the question, wait a minute, can our state afford to pay for this? Because, maybe if we're going to institute a program in California, does my state, Michigan, really need to be paying for a program that we're not going to benefit, And also, does it infringe upon the rights of our state if we pass this law that's going to, maybe benefit other states, but is it going to infringe upon the people in my state? And so, the senator were asking these questions, and really, what senators before 1913 would do, they would fly home every weekend, and they would talk to their state legislature and say, these are the bills that are pending in Washington, D.C. What do you think? How should I vote? Because remember, it was the state legislatures that were voting in the senators, okay, not the people. And so, and the state legislature knows they're closest to the problems of the people. I mean, they live right in the neighborhoods of the people that are electing them. And so they understand the problems at the local level and could counsel that senator that was representing their needs, that state in Washington, D.C. And so when the 17th Amendment was pushed through, there had been a 20-year populist movement to try and get senators elected by people and not by the state legislatures. And the Senate would just refuse to take up that legislation for 20 years. But the entities that wanted this to be passed took advantage of something that happened in the early 1900s. there were some corrupt legislators in Illinois and Chicago that were taking bribes from wealthy people that wanted to be senators. So they were paying members of the state legislature in Illinois to put them in as senators. And so these entities that wanted the 17th Amendment passed use this as an example of these corrupt legislators. The people should be voting in our senators, not corrupt legislators. What they should have done is just let the people vote it, those corrupt state legislative people out of office. But instead, they convinced 2/3 of the states that, yeah, people should vote for senators, and they were actually going to have a constitutional convention. And Congress didn't want that, so they conceded and they passed the 17th Amendment, which made the citizens now be able to vote for senators, and no one now was looking out for the states. These entities that wanted the 16th and the 17th Amendment to pass were wealthy, tax-exempt foundations, Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Rothschild, and they wanted to be able to buy politicians, and they couldn't buy senators when the senators were beholden to the state legislatures. But when now the senators are just like the House members, they need to get reelected by the people. So the first time a senator is elected to office and goes to Washington, D.C., he is elected by a state. But the second time he runs again is 6 years from now, it is not the state that puts him into office. It is the PAC money and the special interest money, special interest groups. Oftentimes these special interest groups don't even reside in the state that he represents. So he's more beholden to these wealthy entities and then coming home and representing his constituents. Do you see how that check and balance? No one is looking out for the states anymore because they're all just worried about how they're going to get reelected. Did you know on average it takes $16 million for a senator to run for office or to be reelected? So they need to be fostering those relationships with special interest groups. And of course, they become beholden to what those special interests, these entities, these tax-exempt organizations want. And these tax-exempt organizations didn't like this slow, deliberative legislative process of the Senate having to go home and counsel with their states. They wanted legislation to be passed quickly so it would serve their own special needs. They were growing empires and dynasties in the early 1900s, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Rothschilds. And so it beholded them to be able to control not only the House members with donations and money, but the senators as well. And so now instead of, the senators coming home and conferring with the state legislatures, they're conferring with where their money's coming from so they can get reelected. And I think of Mitt Romney as an example of a senator who has done that. He is not beholden. He does not represent the people. I have family that live in Utah, and he is definitely not representing the wants and needs of the constituents of Utah. But if he had to come home every weekend and stand before the state legislature and tell them why he's voting the way he is, and if he's voting contrary to what the state legislature wants, he would know that they were not going to put him in office when his term is over. He would be doing some things differently. And so anyways, just know that what I've given you is a lot of kind of meaty things to think about, the 16th and 17th Amendment, because it kind of goes against your intuition that, of course, people should vote for their leaders. Well, this was a check and a balance that the founders purposely put in, that the senators would be beholden to the state legislature. And you might have to reread this a few times for it to really sink in. And you might have to try and explain it to your husband, because sometimes when you have to explain something to someone, it clicks in your mind. You're able to figure it out, even though it might not come out very smoothly. Just keep explaining why this 16th and 17th Amendment was such a bad disruption to the flow of our country, and some real problems have spawned from the 16th and 17th Amendment. So 1913, when the 16th and 17th was passed, was was a bad year for our country. And it all took place under Woodrow Wilson. And he also, under him, in 1913, they instituted the Federal Reserve. And we're going to talk about this in this third seminar, but the Federal Reserve basically just handed over our finances of our country to private banks, really private international banks. So these banks now were going to control the money in America using our tax dollars. And they called it the Federal Reserve in hopes that it would allay people that, oh, it's federal, it's backed by the government, but it is not. These are international banks that control our money systems. And there is no reserve because we went off the gold and silver standard years ago. And so we will kind of explain this more in the third seminar, but our money systems, we do not control the money in our country, and there's a lot of problems that have come from that. Okay. Whew. That's kind of heavy duty learning right there, girls. So the 18th Amendment, they prohibited hard liquor and wine and beer. It was during World War II, and they needed alcohol for the manufacturers and the munitions. But people, I think it's one thing to take away the hard liquor, but beer and wine, I mean, like, that's a staple for some, groups. And so the making of alcohol went underground, and it came, this is when you see these speakeasies and the bootlegging and the gangster era. In fact, some will say this is how the Kennedy family got rich during this time, because they got into bootlegging. And maybe this is why they weren't always accepted into society in the early beginnings, because they didn't make their money legitimately. I think they did at some point begin to become legit, but that's some of the rumors about the Kennedy family. And so they prohibited alcohol in the 18th Amendment, and that is going to be repealed 14 years later with the 21st Amendment. We'll talk about that in just a minute. So the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote in 1920, even though 20 states already were having women vote, because it says in Article 1 that it's the rights of the state to determine who votes. And so 100 years ago, last year, 2020, was the 100th anniversary of women being able to vote nationally. And actually, me and Kimberly Fletcher, the president of Moms for America, spoke on this issue in front of Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that, we secured the right 100 years ago, and now it is up to us to protect the rights. As mothers, we have got to rise up and protect fair elections and honest elections, because if our rising generations don't think our elections are fair or right, we really don't have America, do we? And that's why, what just happened coming off an election that was fraudulent, I believe, in many ways, we've got to rise up and ensure that this doesn't happen. And we're seeing all kind of legislation being passed, and I'm not sure it's good legislation. But this is an issue that we're going to have to continue to raise our voice if we're going to protect this vote that, that many worked hard to get 100 years ago. And so moving on to the 20th Amendment is, it's called the lame duck amendment. Now, hang with me. This isn't a very sexy amendment. You can be like, what's this one about? But Congress people back in that day, were elected, members of Congress in the House are elected every 2 years. And what it actually meant is if they were elected on an even year, they were supposed to stay in office until that session ended. So some of them might end up serving for an additional 13 months and represent people that refused to even vote for them. And so they were known as lame ducks. Their hearts weren't quite right in it. And so they changed this amendment to mean that when a member of Congress is voted in November, there's only a 2-month lapse period to when he is installed January 3rd. And also it it condenses the time when the president is voted in November. He wasn't installed until March 14th. There was 4 months of a waiting period from when the president that won was made the president. And that's because back in the olden days, sometimes it took that long for the winner to pack down his house, get his horse and buggy, and move to Washington, D.C. But because of modern communication and transportation, we don't need to wait 4 months for the president to be installed. But I can imagine they did not anticipate when this amendment was passed in 1933 that fraudulent elections might actually make it necessary to give us a little bit more time than just 2 months. So we just saw this played out in the last election. We probably could have really used that additional 2 months, March 4th instead of January 20th for the president to be installed. But that's basically what the 20th Amendment did, was kind of condense some of that lag time of a potential lame duck politician. So the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment, the prohibition on alcohol. So it didn't necessarily legalize alcohol, but it said, hey, we're going to let the states determine their liquor laws, and that's just an example of when the federal government infringes upon state rights. It doesn't always end well, because now we have the mafia and the gangsters, and it was like a whole life of its own prohibition had spawned. And so they repealed that 18th Amendment and let the state decide how they were going to have their liquor laws. The 22nd Amendment, are you all with me, ladies? I mean, we're cruising through these amendments that like law students would take 4 or 5 months just to study one class, And so I'm just really impressed. So we're on the 22nd Amendment, and that gives term limits to the president that they can only run for 2 terms. Now, up until this point, we had no limitations on how many times the president could run. But George Washington stepped down after 2 terms, and every single president after that followed the example of George Washington, except for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was on his 4th term when he died in office. He was going on 12 years as the president. And under him, he grew the executive branch in a way that they had never seen before. He was the author of all those New Deal programs. And so after he died, they immediately passed this amendment because they did not like what he had done his 12 years in office. So the 23rd Amendment gave Washington, D.C. voting rights. Now, our founding fathers wanted that DC area to be a neutral zone, 10 miles by 10 miles. They wanted it to kind of be free from some of the storm center of violence that they had seen in the early history in Philadelphia. But guess what? The 23rd Amendment, they did not fully understand what the founders intended, because it gave Washington, D.C. some voting privileges. And now Washington, D.C. is one of the most liberal places in America, and it is a very politically hostile environment to conservative politicians. So President Trump, when he lived here for 4 years, you never saw him out and about town because of the hostile environment that this 23rd Amendment created. I think the only place President Trump ever ate in Washington, D.C., now this is my town, I've lived here for decades, the only place Trump ever ate was at his hotel, the Trump Hotel, which is right down the street from the White House. And there's a really delicious steakhouse. It's called BLT Prime. And we've eaten there several times. It's a beautiful hotel. You need to visit that. It's just beautiful, it's stunning. And they have a table that they would reserve for the president that no one ever ate at except for President Trump, because it's the only place you really could eat in peace in Washington, D.C. Now, I've lived in D.C. and I have eaten at restaurants. When President Clinton was the president at Sequoia in Georgetown, he and I were eating at the same restaurant. And it was just like a love fest. Everyone was so excited. They loved him. And President Obama would go shopping at Union Station on the Hill every Christmas with his girls, they're out and about. But because it is turned into a political zone with voting rights and so forth. If you don't subscribe to the way they believe, if you're more conservative leaning, you pretty much just hold up in the White House. And so I've seen that come to play because of this 23rd Amendment. The 24th Amendment really was just addressing the southern states were charging a little couple dollar poll tax for people to be able to go vote. And it was discouraging poor Black and white citizens from voting. And so they did away with polling taxes. You don't have to pay to vote. And the 25th Amendment, we're coming to the end, girls. The 25th Amendment is bad. It is the Presidential Disability Amendment, meaning if you think the president is incapacitated or unfit, he can be removed from office. And the vice president is the one that initiates that. And if he or she can convince 8 out of the 15 cabinet members in the president's cabinet that the president is unfit, the president can be removed, which is so interesting. So just imagine if Vice President Kamala Harris convinces 8 out of the 15 cabinet members that Biden is not fit to be president anymore. They can remove him from office, and she can put in her own vice president. So you could potentially have a president and a vice president who are completely unvetted and have never been voted on. So it could be potentially a very dangerous thing. Now, if the President Biden goes, wait a minute, I have my capacities, I can be president. He goes before Congress and they have 21 days to determine if he really is fit. But in the meantime, you have a vice president who's become president and her selected vice president who can who can govern this country for 21 days. So it's fraught with peril. And interesting enough, a week after the violent riots, January 6th on Capitol Hill, under Pelosi, the House passed a resolution invoking the 25th Amendment to remove Trump because he was not fit to be president. The only problem with that was the Vice President Pence wanted nothing to do with that. So it just died in the water, so to speak. But you can also see, like Abraham Lincoln at the time during the Civil War, often he stood alone when he was making some of the most difficult decisions. And under this Presidential Disability Amendment, Lincoln could have been removed by his cabinet and his vice president. So it needs to be done away with. It's a dangerous amendment. And then the 26th Amendment just lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. Kind of the adage was being circulated, if you're old enough to fight in war, you should be old enough to vote. So they lowered the voting age to 18. But what it's done, it's really widened that voter base of 18 to 24. And they're kind of an age that's susceptible to emotional appeal and activism. And wouldn't you know, out of that 18 to 24 range, 65% of them voted for Biden, and 11% more in that age range came out to vote than any other age group in the last presidential election. So that is, this 26th Amendment has fared well for the Democrat Party. And then the 27th Amendment was just saying we can't give our congressmen a raise while they are in office. So girls, there you have it. We have finished studying the Constitution from the viewpoint of the founders, and then these additional 15 amendments that were given after they had all died and gone their way. So, you know, having studied the Constitution as established by the founders, and now seeing how it has been changed by these additional 15 amendments and all the judicial opinions and legislation that has come from, you know, upholding some of these newer amendments, we can see, though, why we have some of the problems that we have. Now, this seminar 3, so make sure you have this for next week and you read that first little section, the attacks on the Charter of Freedom. It's going to delve more into these groups, these tax exempt groups, and Soros is we'll lop him into these groups as well, who want to fundamentally change the direction of America. And they have used their power and their wealth and their resources to do this, to serve their own special needs. And we're also going to talk about entities that have spent millions and millions of dollars defaming and defiling the reputation of our founding fathers, Jefferson, Franklin, George Washington. If they can get you to believe our founding fathers were hypocrites and racists and perverts and degenerates, then we're less likely to uphold their life. And we're certainly more likely to minimize the teachings and the writings that they gave us. So if you can defile their personalities, you can defile their principles and their writings and what they left us in this Constitution. And girls, we're also going to talk about what in the world has happened in our education system. Why are our kids, believing what they're believing? We're going to talk about some of these early education reformers in America in the mid 1800s. Have you heard of a man by the name of Horace Mann? He was an education reformer. And John Dewey was Horace Mann's disciple, and Horace Mann's disciple was Karl Marx. So Horace Mann took some of Marx's ideas and started to embed them in the school system, and he was our go-to guy in America. And then John Dewey, we think of the Dewey Decimal System, kind of innocent. Oh, there was a lot of nefariousness about John Dewey. These men were godless, and they did not believe in moral education. And what they, the ideas that they perpetuated in the early 1900s are the reasons why we see some of the things in our classrooms today. So we're going to understand how in the world, did we get to this point? And girls, I haven't talked about this too much, but this is such a good book. If I could recommend it, The Promises of the Constitution by Pam Openshaw. And Vivian will give you the information on how to get this. I think there's only one left on Amazon, but if you go right to her website, thepromisesoftheconstitution.com, you can buy it for $30. And she gives like these little one-page condensed vignettes on everything that we talk about. And it's so when you read it, it just helps you to understand it and put it in a real succinct way. And she talks about these godless philosophies that we started to uphold in the early 1900s, and that has created a dependence, instead of independence from government. It's created us to be more dependent upon these godless people and entities that got in and made some fundamental shifts in America. And so girls, we're halfway through our Healing of America seminar. We've gone through 2 of the 4 manuals. Congratulations, you're hanging in there. You will find Seminar 3 really interesting because we are living Seminar 3. We're seeing these things take effect, and you're going to begin to understand, oh, this is how it happened when you understand the history of it. But remember, 85% of the Constitution is intact. So when you just understand some of these amendments that have been misinterpreted or distorted from what our founders wanted can be changed. And it is possible. Look, there's 2 ways that we're going to change this country. The first is we're just going to repent. We're going to realize we got to wake up. We got to turn to God. We got to start to get involved. Or we're going to have an internal collapse, and we're going to have some foreign government intervention. And we don't want to change our country by that way. And so I really do believe, ladies, it will be you when the women wake up. It will be you that make this change when they wake up and they see this protective umbrella that we've had of the Constitution over our families. When we're starting to feel these fiery darts from bad legislation and Supreme Court decisions and big tech censorship and corrupt elections and godless education, when we feel these fiery darts starting to come directly into our homes, into our children and grandchildren, we're going to wake up. we're going to wake our husband up. We're going to wake up the people that we love, our neighbors, and so forth. And we're going to start to look to God. We need help. I am worried. What should we do? And we're going to start to pray. We're going to start to get into the word, and we're going to try and keep our little family closer and tighter. And we're going to heal some relationships that need to be healed because we want to be able to influence our children and grandchildren. And then we're going to study the Constitution from the viewpoint of the founding fathers, because our founding fathers said that this Constitution came from inspiration of God. It was struck off by the hand of God. I mean, we know God is a God of miracles. Do you remember Benjamin Franklin, how he prayed like crazy during the Constitutional Convention when it looked like it was going to break up? And it was a miracle, that Constitutional Convention. Those men were able to come together and keep their wits together and do what they did. And we'll be reminded that God is a God of miracles, and hang in there. He's always been involved in the creation of this country, that he is not going to establish this first free people in modern times just to see it collapse. That America will be saved, but it will be by the mamas, grandmas, you ladies. It will be us. And God says, look, I work through small and simple means. So don't think, oh, what can I do? I'm only a mom. What can I do? Don't worry, that God loves small and simple people to bring about his purposes. All right, dear ladies. Okay, we're finished.